The river ran black with ink and red with blood the day the Mongols reached Baghdad. In the winter of 1258, the world's greatest city believed its walls were unbreakable, its scholars untouchable, its legacy eternal. But within weeks, the capital of the Islamic Golden Age would fall beneath thunderous hooves and merciless steel, shattered by an empire that had already swallowed half the known world and had no intention of stopping at the gates of paradise. For 5 centuries, Baghdad had stood as the beating heart of civilization, a city of glittering domes, crowded markets, observatories, libraries, and scholars whose discoveries shaped mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. Founded in 762 by the Abbasid Caliphate, it rose along the Tigris River as a masterpiece of urban design and intellectual ambition, drawing thinkers from Persia, Central Asia, Arabia, and beyond into a thriving center known as the House of Wisdom, where ancient Greek texts were translated, algebra refined, and scientific methods quietly advanced centuries ahead of Europe. And while kingdoms in the West struggled through feudal conflicts, Baghdad shone as a symbol of stability and divine favor, its caliphs claiming spiritual authority over millions, its markets overflowing with silk, spices, and gold, its poets praising a city they believed God himself had blessed. Yet by the mid-13th century, cracks had begun to form beneath the golden surface. As internal corruption weakened leadership, provincial governors grew bold, rival Muslim powers contested influence, and the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim relied more on courtly comfort than military readiness, dismissing warnings of an approaching storm rising from the east, because far beyond the deserts and mountains a new kind of empire had been forged in fire and discipline, born from the windswept steppes of Mongolia, where tribes once divided by rivalry had been united under Genghis Khan into the most formidable war machine the world had ever seen, an army built on speed, psychological terror, and ruthless efficiency, masters of mounted archery who could strike from miles away, feign retreat only to encircle enemies, and coordinate movements across vast distances with chilling precision. And after Genghis Khan's death, his descendants carried forward a vision not merely of conquest but of total domination, reducing cities that resisted into smoking ruins as a warning to others, sparing those who submitted but annihilating those who defied them. And by the 1250s, Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, had been tasked by the great Khan Mongke with expanding Mongol control into the Islamic heartlands, eliminating threats and securing trade routes, beginning with the Nizari Ismailis in Persia, whose mountain fortresses fell one by one beneath siege engines and relentless assault. And as Hulagu advanced westward, he sent envoys to Baghdad demanding submission, tribute, and cooperation, promising safety if the caliph acknowledged Mongol supremacy. Yet within the marble halls of Baghdad, arrogance and miscalculation prevailed as advisors underestimated the Mongol threat, believing distance and divine favor would shield them, and al-Mustasim reportedly responded with half-hearted diplomacy, neither fully submitting nor preparing adequately for war, failing to rally neighboring Muslim powers into a unified defense. And so in late 1257, Hulagu marched toward Baghdad with an army estimated between 100,000 and 150,000 soldiers, including Mongol cavalry, Turkish auxiliaries, Chinese engineers skilled in seacraft, and Persian troops familiar with the terrain, a multinational force hardened by years of brutal campaigns. And when they approached the city in January 1258, they executed a classic strategy of encirclement, dividing their forces to surround Baghdad on both sides of the Tigris, cutting off escape routes and supply lines, constructing pontoon bridges to maneuver with terrifying flexibility, while inside the city panic spread among civilians who had never witnessed an enemy of such scale and reputation. And though the caliph finally mustered an army to confront them, it was poorly organized and disastrously led, suffering a crushing defeat outside the city walls that left Baghdad exposed and demoralized. And within days, Mongol siege engines began their relentless bombardment, hurling massive stones and incendiary projectiles over the walls, shattering towers, collapsing defenses, and igniting fires that lit the winter sky, while Mongol archers rained arrows upon defenders who dared show themselves. And Despite desperate resistance from segments of the population, the outcome was becoming inevitable because the Mongols had perfected siege warfare by incorporating engineers from conquered lands, using catapults, trebuchets, and explosive devices to break even the strongest fortifications, and on February 10, 1258, after less than 2 weeks of siege, Baghdad's defenses crumbled and surrender negotiations began. But surrender to the Mongols did not guarantee mercy, especially for a city that had hesitated and resisted, and when Hulagu entered Baghdad, the illusion of eternal glory vanished forever. What followed was not merely a military occupation, but a calculated destruction designed to erase resistance and send a message to the world that defiance carried unbearable consequences, and for days, perhaps weeks according to some accounts, the Mongol soldiers unleashed systematic slaughter upon the population, killing soldiers, civilians, men, women, and children in numbers that chroniclers claimed reached into the hundreds of thousands. Though exact figures remain debated, yet there is no doubt that the scale of violence was catastrophic beyond precedent in the region's history. Streets once filled with scholars and merchants became rivers of corpses, homes were looted and burned, mosques desecrated, and the caliph himself was captured and executed, reportedly wrapped in a carpet and trampled by horses to avoid spilling royal blood directly upon the earth, symbolizing the end of Abbasid political authority in Baghdad, and perhaps even more devastating than the loss of life was the annihilation of knowledge as the great libraries, including the House of Wisdom, were destroyed, manuscripts accumulated over centuries thrown into the Tigris, until, as legend tells, the river ran black from ink and red from blood. Though historians debate the literal accuracy of that image, its symbolic truth remains undeniable, because an intellectual center that had preserved and expanded the wisdom of ancient civilizations was reduced to ashes, astronomers lost their instruments, physicians their treatises, philosophers their commentaries, and the fragile chain of scholarly transmission was violently severed, while artisans were either killed or enslaved, and infrastructure collapsed under the weight of devastation, irrigation systems damaged, trade networks shattered, and survivors left traumatized in a city transformed into a graveyard. And yet amid the horror there was also calculated pragmatism, because the Mongols were not mindless destroyers, but strategic rulers who often incorporated skilled administrators and craftsmen into their expanding empire. And after the massacre subsided, Hulagu established the Ilkhanate, integrating Persian bureaucratic expertise into Mongol governance, gradually adopting aspects of local culture and eventually converting to Islam in later generations, demonstrating the paradox of Mongol rule, which could obliterate a civilization in one moment and preserve elements of it in another. But for Baghdad, the psychological blow was irreversible, because the city that had symbolized unity and divine favor had been humiliated and broken. Its caliphate effectively ended as a political force, even though a shadow Abbasid line would later be re-established in Cairo under Mamluk protection, and across the Islamic world shockwaves rippled as rulers realized that no wall was high enough, no lineage sacred enough to guarantee survival against Mongol might, prompting urgent military reforms and alliances, culminating years later in the Mamluk victory at Ain Jalut in 1260, which halted further Mongol advance into Egypt. Yet even that triumph could not undo the trauma of 1258, because Baghdad never fully recovered its former supremacy, its golden age extinguished in smoke and silence, and historians continue to debate whether the Mongol sack marked the true end of the Islamic Golden Age or merely accelerated transformations already underway. But what remains indisputable is that the destruction of Baghdad reshaped global history by weakening a central hub of scientific progress, altering trade dynamics, and signaling a shift of power that would influence the Middle East for centuries. And in the broader sweep of world history, the fall of Baghdad stands as a stark reminder of how quickly cultural brilliance can be undone by political complacency and military miscalculation. How empires that appear invincible can crumble within days when confronted by adaptive and disciplined adversaries, and how the legacy of conquest is never purely about territory, but about memory, identity, and the fragile preservation of knowledge, because while the Mongol Empire would eventually fragment and evolve, and while new centers of learning would rise in places like Cairo, Samarkand, and later Istanbul, the memory of 1258 lingered as a cautionary tale whispered through generations. a symbol of both the destructive capacity of human ambition and the resilience of cultures that survive even their darkest hours. And as the smoke cleared over the ruins of Baghdad, the world understood that a chapter had closed forever, not with a quiet fading, but with the thunder of hooves and the crack of collapsing walls, leaving behind a transformed Middle East and a story that still echoes through history as one of the most dramatic and devastating sieges ever recorded.